Coming up with the multi-layered titles for these episodes is sometimes the hardest part of doing the whole thing. For this one, I nearly went with something quite a bit more personal, and I nearly called it The Silence in Grandfather's Eyes. But when I realized that I was injecting maybe a little bit too much of my own personal life and my own personal experiences into the story, I had to pull myself out of it and not use that title because I realized how many people worldwide are affected by this. It's not just me. If this affects you or someone in your life, my sympathies are with you. This is not an easy thing to deal with. There are diseases that will kill a man outright. And then there's diseases that linger around the house for quite a while. They sit in the parlor, they sleep in the guest room, they eat supper with the family, and they just kind of wait around until everybody's guard is down before they begin to steal things. A face here, a birthday there, a grandchild's name, a wedding anniversary, the route home. Little pieces at first and then larger ones, until finally the poor afflicted soul is left standing in the middle of his own life, looking around like a traveler who stepped off the wrong train. That's the sort of disease that's tied forever to the name of Alzheimer. And the particular thing about Alois Alzheimer himself is that by all accounts, he was not a gloomy, grim, or dramatic sort of man. He was a scientist. He was a doctor, a fellow who fenced in college and disturbed the peace at least once in Germany with youthful enthusiasm, and probably drank coffee strong enough to remove paint from furniture. And yet his story saddled him with a disease so heartbreaking that entire families whisper its name like they're trying not to wake something sleeping in the next room. I apologize, this one's a little bit more difficult for me than usual. We're going to travel back in time now to June 14th of 1864. That was the day that Alois Alzheimer entered the world of Bavaria. And if there's anything that history enjoys doing, it's hiding enormous consequences inside very ordinary beginnings. He was born to a Catholic family in the little town of Machbreit, where people likely assumed the child would grow into some respectable profession, involving possibly ledgers, shoes, maybe some mild disappointment from his parents. Instead, he grew fascinated with medicine and the human brain, which at that point in history was still pretty poorly understood. Doctors in those days had three favorite hobbies: guessing, bleeding people, and arguing. If a patient sneezed too hard, one doctor prescribed leeches, and another prescribed prayer, and a third suggested fresh air, while charging twice as much as both of the other two combined. Neurology was especially mysterious. The brain might as well have been a locked attic full of ghosts. Yet Alzheimer's walked directly toward that mystery. He studied medicine in Berlin, Würzburg, and Nuremberg. He joined a fencing fraternity. He became a physician in 1887, and not long afterward, this man began working at an asylum in Frankfurt with mentally ill and epileptic patients. This was admirable. Now, there's no pleasant way to describe 19th century asylums that can be possibly described as being respectable places. So I'm not even going to attempt it. These were very sad places, loud, lonely places with iron beds and stone walls and empty corridors and chains and abuse. And some patients shouted all night, and some just stared at the ceilings, and some wandered in circles, and some completely forgot their own languages. The smell alone probably deserved its own medical diagnosis. It is not a place you wanted to be. But this is where Alzheimer's found his calling and where he chose to be. Not because he enjoyed the suffering, like many others that were found in asylums in those days, and not because he enjoyed the madness. He certainly didn't. And not because he enjoyed despair. He hated it. But he wanted answers. And in those long corridors, he met another neurologist by the name of Franz Nissl. The two men spent years studying the brain together, slicing tissue samples thinner than onion skins, while trying to understand what exactly happened inside of the human skull when memory failed. And now I want you to imagine trying to study the brain in the late 1800s. There's no modern scanners, no MRI machines, no sophisticated imaging machines. There's just microscopes, stains, notebooks, patients, endless patients. The kind of patients normally found only in fishermen and men waiting for government paperwork. And then came Auguste Deter. If this were a novel, this would be the moment that thunder rolled outside, because Augustine entered the Frankfurt Asylum in 1901. She was only 51 years old, which is far too young for severe dementia. But this woman forgot words. She forgot conversation. She forgot where she was. Sometimes she became paranoid, sometimes frightened, sometimes confused enough to seem lost inside of her own thoughts. I recognize this. Alzheimer's became fascinated by her case. And yes, fascinated sounds cold. But medicine often kind of disguises compassion behind professional words. The truth is that he could see something terrible unfolding inside of her mind, and unlike many doctors of the era, he refused to just shrug and move on and let her suffer. He protected her from transfer requests when her husband wanted to move her somewhere cheaper. He arranged to keep her records. He even made arrangements to study her brain after she did eventually pass. That sentence gives some people chills, sure. There was a doctor waiting for a patient's brain. But without that strange arrangement, modern medicine might have remained quite blind for far longer. But here's where the story becomes painfully familiar for millions of families, because Alzheimer's was something many listeners will probably know all too well. There was the gradual vanishing, not death, not exactly. Something slower, something crueler. There's the forgetting. I know people hearing this who have watched a grandfather stare at them without recognition. I'm one of them. I know people who have explained who they are to their own mother 3 times in the same hour. I know people who have watched somebody lose names and lose places and lose memories and finally lose themselves. I saw my grandfather walk into my grandmother's bedroom when I was 8. And he told him, "Lady, I don't know who you are or how I got here, but if you promise to let me stay till morning, I'll be gone before you wake up." They had been married for over 40 years by then. My own grandfather did suffer. By the time I was 8 years old, he no longer knew who I was. But more than that, he didn't know who my grandmother was. And there's something uniquely terrible about that kind of grief, because the body remains while the familiar person just slips further away until they're just gone. It's like standing on shore and watching somebody drift out to sea inch by inch while still sitting in the same chair. And Auguste Deter died in 1906. She'd been in that asylum for 5 years at that point. And by all accounts, she was fairly well taken care of, thanks to Alois. And afterward, Alois Alzheimer examined her brain using newly developed staining techniques alongside 2 Italian physicians. And what he found changed medicine forever. He found plaques and tangles, physical anomalies and abnormalities woven throughout the brain itself. At last, there was evidence. Not just theories and not guesses, not superstition, but real changes inside the tissue. And then came perhaps the funniest and saddest moment in the entire story. On November 3rd of 1906, Alzheimer presented his findings publicly before gathering psychiatrists. This was exciting. This was big. This was a major development in brain science, and almost nobody cared. And that is not some exaggeration. The audience of 88 physicians showed greater enthusiasm for the next lecture instead, which concerned, how do I put this nicely? Compulsive self-pleasure. Imagine discovering one of the most devastating diseases in human history, only to get bumped aside because the crowd preferred scandalous material instead. Humanity has not changed nearly as much as we flatter ourselves into believing that we have. You could announce the cure for death tomorrow, but if the fellow across the hall promised a lecture titled 10 Terrible Secrets About Your Neighbor, half the audience would wander off carrying popcorn. Still, Alois Alzheimer continued his work. And then the story twisted again, because another physician named Oskar Fischer was simultaneously researching dementia and discovering similar abnormalities in the brain. Fischer and Alzheimer disagreed on important interpretations of the disease. One emphasized the plaques, the other focused heavily on the tangles and the symptoms. And they argued through papers that they published, and through research, and through medical debate. But here's the haunting part. These two men never actually met. Alzheimer's died too young. The detail feels kind of almost fictional. Two men standing on opposite sides of one of medicine's greatest discoveries, both staring in the same darkness, and yet death prevented the conversation from ever happening. By 1912, Alois Alzheimer himself had become seriously ill while traveling to a new academic post in Breslau. His health declined steadily over the next few years, with infection and heart problems and kidney disease and failure, and his body betrayed him piece by piece, much like my grandfather's brain betrayed him piece by piece. And in 1915, at only 51 years old, Alois Alzheimer died. 51. That's younger than many of the people listening or watching this episode right now. You spend your whole life trying to understand memory, only to vanish before seeing the full importance of your own work. There's something brutally poetic about that, in the Edgar Allan Poe kind of way. Meanwhile, the disease carrying his name spread quietly through the 20th century. Families began recognizing the patterns. A father forgetting tools in the barn, a mother forgetting recipes that she'd cooked for 30 years, a grandmother accusing strangers of stealing objects she herself had misplaced, and even somebody like myself, leaving things where they're not meant to be and getting angry about it because I know what's coming. Eventually, medicine realized that Alzheimer's disease was not rare at all. It was everywhere. It was waiting, growing, lingering. And by the late 20th century, the disease had become one of humanity's greatest fears, not merely because it kills, but because it dismantles identity itself. Cancer, that attacks the body. Heart disease attacks the heart, but Alzheimer's attacks the story a person tells about who they are. That's why it terrifies people. It steals biographies, one memory at a time. And still today, scientists wrestle with it. Plaques and tangles and genetics and inflammation and treatments and research. There's billions spent trying to understand the same mysterious things that Alois Alzheimer stared into over a century ago with primitive microscopes and extraordinary amounts of patience. But here's something worth remembering. Alois Alzheimer himself did not create this disease. He did not invent it. He did not unleash it. He simply looked directly at suffering, and he gave it a name, his own. And sometimes naming a thing is the first step toward fighting it. There is dignity in that. There's also courage and humanity in that. History happens in strange ways. A quiet German doctor studies one frightened woman in an asylum, and generations later, millions of people know his name, though most wish they didn't. And perhaps that's the saddest sort of immortality there is. I did a quick lookup. Genetics and family history affect Alzheimer's in two primary ways. I did get this directly from a Google search. If you want to know more about it, I would suggest doing some of your own research. Make sure you go to the reputable websites, not the conspiracy-laced ones. But there are the two primary ways, which are late onset Alzheimer's, which was what my grandfather had, and that is the most common. So basically, everyone inherits 2 copies of this particular gene. One specific variant increases your risk of developing the disease, especially if you inherit a copy from both parents. I know that this runs in my family. I've mentioned that a couple of times now. But having that variant increases your susceptibility, but it's not a direct cause, thankfully. Many people with this gene never develop Alzheimer's, and many who develop it do not have the gene. But having a first-degree relative, a parent or a sibling with Alzheimer's greatly increases your relative risk by about 30%, but overall, age remains the most significant risk factor. That sounds terrible. And then there's also early onset familial Alzheimer's, which is rather rare. The direct inheritance means in less than 1 to 5% of cases, Alzheimer's is caused by specific rare mutations in one of 3 different genes. I have many, many gene mutations going on in my body, which is why I deal with autoimmune disease so often. But this form of disease it typically appears in a person in their 30s, 40s, or 50s. If a parent carries one of these specific mutations, each of their children has a 50% chance of inheriting it. If inherited, the person will almost certainly develop early onset familial Alzheimer's. There are a couple of other things in recent years where people have said that abundance of sugar consumption or alcohol consumption can also be linked directly to Alzheimer's, but there are still studies going through with those things. And there are additional factors such as exercise, diet, chemicals, and smoking that can have positive and negative effects on Alzheimer's. So there's still a lot that we still need to learn about this. It's probably not going to be solved in our lifetime. Definitely not in mine. So tonight I want to leave you with this question. If memories really truly are what make us who we are, then what single memory would you fight the hardest to protect if you knew that Alzheimer's might someday show up in you? Or that one memory might someday disappear forever? I have a few photos that I save. And in the age when most people have stopped printing out and hanging photos of people on their walls, this is still something that I do on purpose. If you're affected by this, if you're affected by Alzheimer's or you know someone who is, my heart goes out to you. Thank you for watching.